All right, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to episode 148 of the Designated Players Podcast. We are back to dive into MLS history, specifically focusing on the 1998 season. Today, we cover three topics, including the historic 1998 double winning season of the newly minted expansion team Chicago Fire. We move on then to a very memorable playoff run for the Columbus Crew that ended their time in Ohio Stadium, finishing with the Kansas City Wizards and their deal with Olive Garden during the 1998 preseason. My name is Andrew. I'm here with my good buddy Connor, and this is MLS History Retold. How you doing, buddy?
Doing, buddy.
It's been quite a little bit since we sat down and talked MLS history, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been like what, a whole 7 days?
It's been like a whole week. That's crazy. Crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy because it's not like we don't do this every other week, you know?
I
It's
know. It's supposed to be
extended
every
break.
week. I'm really excited for this. We have talked at nauseum about the success and craziness of the 98 double winning season for the Chicago Fire. When we did season one, episode whatever, doing the best team of all time bracket, they made it pretty far, if I remember correctly. So I'm excited to cover that today. I think it's going to be a really cool story for you and for me and for all of our fans because we're going to dive a little bit into some very, very crazy games, including an Open Cup semifinal that had 3 red cards and 45 fouls. Not what I was
Jeez.
expecting during my research, but here we are. You're covering two stories today. Which one are you most excited to talk about?
I feel like the Olive Garden story is the most wacky one, but there's not a lot of depth to it. So I think it's the more interesting, but there's not going to be too much to talk about. So I guess I'll favor towards the Cruise 98 playoff run.
Nice. Well, then I ask you because we usually try to stay on brand for this. Which scarf are you rocking today? Do you have a Wizards one, or do you have to don the scarf of the team that absolutely whooped your boys 6-1 this weekend?
You just had to throw it in there, didn't you?
I couldn't take a chance not to bring it up.
I really, really, really wish I had an SKC scarf because then I could avoid having to wear the Columbus scarf. But sadly, I do not. So I will be donning for the second time now on MLS Retold my MLS Cup winning crew scarf. Same one as I think 2 episodes ago. Yeah, when we talked about the Columbus Crew pitch invasion.
That's right. That's right. What a great episode that was. If you guys haven't heard it, you should go back, take a listen to it. It's fantastic. These stories are something that most people I don't think have ever heard of. I know this is my first time hearing about the Olive Garden story. And then there's also the other ones, right? Like there are stories here that people know about. Oh, Chicago won a double in 98, right? Some people might know that, but most people won't know how important that was, right? It was their first year in the league. It was the first time that they had all come together to play. They went on this crazy run after having a relatively not so great start to the year. And we'll dive into it, but the diving into the games, diving into how it happened, that's what we're here for. So we hope you enjoy it. Make sure if you do, you leave us a like, you leave us a follow, you share it with your friends, and you follow us wherever you get your podcast so you know when it goes live. We are doing this basically through the end of the year. So we will have so much to talk about. We want to hear from you. I, myself, as I'm covering Chicago, very luckily, I might add, got a vintage Chicago Fire scarf. And when I say
Say
vintage, I
vintage.
mean, when's the last time you've seen that badge? That's right, never.
I'm glad I don't have to see that
I know it
badge.
was
I'm kind
awful,
of sad that
wasn't
you
it?
brought it back into my life.
I know, bad, wasn't it? But we're here, we're rocking the Chicago Fire scarf. But in a flip, I'm going to let you start off with one of your stories. You can go ahead and go first.
All right, let's talk Olive Garden. You know, everybody's favorite local mom and pop Italian place, right? I'll be honest with you, this is totally sidetracked. I don't think I've ever been to an Olive Garden before. Not that I haven't
That's
like, seen them around and stuff, but I don't think I've ever been to one before.
that's criminal. So Olive Garden is the must have when we're doing away trips for Alfred. And when we go recruiting, myself and my coach, it is always at least one Olive Garden trip. Fantastic.
I can't say I'm desperate to get out there, but I'm sure I will be at an Olive Garden eventually. But I apologize. I don't remember the name exactly. I want to give some credit that this idea came from the person who was involved with the MLS iceberg, for those that know about that, and had a lot of details and stories behind MLS, kind of similar to like what we're doing now. So while this isn't a story in a lot of depth, we definitely wanted to cover it considering all that that person has done for MLS history. So
Give
I don't know if you
me
have the
just,
details.
yep, give me just 1 second. I don't have the name, but I do have the Reddit account. So
Yeah, that's what I meant. That's what I meant.
I
Yeah.
will tell you that it was, where'd it go? There it is. The Low End Tabasque.
All right.
Yep. So the Low End Tabasque. Thank you for all of your fantastic um, contributions. This is what really kicked us off. I hope you're listening. We'll definitely tag you in it. But it's funny because this story that you're about to tell is actually in a book I read, and I completely overlooked it. So it's Phil West's book called The United States of Soccer. It basically outlines the first 20 years of MLS history, and it's a little tiny one, but it's just a little snippet, but it's mentioned in there. This story that you're about to tell. I won't spoil it, but I just found it funny that I read the whole book before even doing any of this, and just completely like whoosh, cool, whatever, you know.
Yeah, they were nice to link this as a source. So I did pull up this book by Phil West, or article, however you want to classify it. I would say I think it's a book. Um, but yes, so my source for this one is The United States of Soccer by Phil West. And within there, this story is retold by, at the time, the SKC, or the SK Wizards public relations director, Rob Thompson, who is now the chief communications officer for SKC. And this was during this, the story was about the Kansas City Wizards 1998 preseason in Bradenton, Florida. We all know everything amazing happens in Florida. So when it came to the team getting a vitamin rich, nutritious meal, where better to get a sponsorship deal than at the Olive Garden? The Wiz essentially remixed the Dunkin' slogan to KC's on breadsticks for the 1998 preseason. So due to this sponsorship, the Wiz were eating every single meal at Olive Garden, and that consisted of lunch and dinner every day for 6 weeks. That is a lot of meals to be eating at Olive Garden. So I don't really have too much in regard to what exactly their Olive deal kind of looked like, or um, quotes or stuff from the team, but there was an excerpt that I think was related to it that I really wanted to talk about because I thought it was honestly hilarious. So you might be wondering, how would eating Olive Garden every day for 6 weeks impact the team's training? Don't worry, because Rob remembers that very well. So he recalls that 3 days out from their opening preseason game at night, Coach Ron Newman made the team do a 2 mile run. So Rob recalls that the runs worked as follows. So Coach Newman would call Rob when the run was starting, and Rob would start the stopwatch to track everyone's time. And when they crossed the finish line where Rob was stationed, Rob would log their time. So, likely considering their dietary habits in the preseason, Mo Johnston, his forward and future SKC Hall of Famer, had asked Rob if he could start the stopwatch 30 seconds later to help make the times look a little bit better. One problem, though. Robert got to start the stopwatch until 3 minutes in. And so this resulted in some ridiculous times, including an 8:42 mile time from left back Jake Dancy. So to give some perspective on that, this time was about 40 seconds off from the world record 2 mile time in 1998, all while fettuccine Alfredo was filled in his bloodstream. So Coach Newman was somehow not suspicious about these results, and instead was so excited that he decided he was going to play Jake Dancy at striker. Just a reminder that Jake was a left back. Easy to say that the experiment did not last very long and was not very successful. So while this isn't a very in-depth story, that's kind of the brief story of the Kansas City Wizards time in or deal with Olive Garden 1998 preseason.
When you started talking about the 2 mile time, it all came back to me. So I remember reading that story and I texted my friend who was reading the book with me. And I was like, this is the funniest thing ever. Cause the amount of times we've done stuff like that, like in high school, like, oh, like, there's a guy who's hurt. He's going to run the time. Like, yo, Andy, like, start it like 10, 15 seconds late. Like, let's make us all look good. Like, we talk about all the time, but they actually did it. It's just so funny, the little stuff that you don't realize. Um, it's fantastic. That's such a good story.
Yeah, it goes all the way up to the professional level.
People never change. It's so funny. You get the kids who are always going to be kids. You get the guys who are always going to try and sneak that last 10, 15 seconds. It happens wherever you go, and you just gotta go with it. So good. So good. Fantastic book, by the way. Phil West's The United States of Soccer. 110% recommend it. Um, I have learned, and I didn't realize this when I was doing all this work. I'm kind of now turning into like an MLS history nerd. Love anything that has to do with early MLS and telling the story. If you are one of those, it is a great book to read. Definitely consider go looking into it. It's fantastic. One of the other parts of early MLS was the first ever expansion team, or first set of expansion teams, really. We're talking the Chicago Fire in 1998, joining the league with Miami Fusion, which is funny because you see one that didn't make it and one that probably, with recent results, feels like it wouldn't have been a terrible thing if they didn't make it, right? But I say that as a joke. Please don't come after me. You talk about expansion teams and you have this combination of good and bad. It always is. You either got Atlanta, LAFC. Apparently, we're throwing St. Louis in there. Jury's still out. Who get hot from the start. They never look back. And then you get Minnesota, FCC Orlando. They need some time to get adjusted and get going. I would say that the 98 Fire definitely fell into the first group. From day one, they were a force to be reckoned with both in the league and the League Cup. And in 1998, they went and won them both. And this is a story of how it happened. We're going to start in the league. As we mentioned, they were newcomers with Miami Fusion, and they were tossed into the Western Conference. Miami was in the East. They joined the West. And of course, when you have expansion teams, it's MLS. There's only one thing we can do. We got to have a draft. We got to start drafting some players. If you aren't allowed to do anything until you draft something. You have to draft a name. The Fire would get themselves a couple players that would be important, but none more important than Zach Thornton from the New York, New Jersey Metro Stars. Once again, the Metro make the world take, and you'll see why that matters in a minute. They built the rest of their team, as quoted, as to reflect the diversity of their city, adding a ton of Polish internationals, including Peter Nowak, Roman Kosecki, and Jerzy Podbronzy. Yeah, didn't mess that one up. Along with a ton of strong U.S. internationals, including legendary Red Bull manager Chris Armas, legendary Red Bull manager Jesse Marsh, Josh Wolf, and OK Austin manager CJ Brown, Ante Razov, and Frank Klopas, who is also a manager in this league. One of the stories we're going to have to tell at some point, sorry, completely off topic here, is how Chicago bred like every manager in MLS. Because I feel like every time you look at a manager in MLS, somebody has a tie to the Chicago Fire of pre-2000. It's ridiculous. The best part of all of this, though, they were led by the biggest, baldest head in managerial coaching, Bob Bradley. Shiny dome, big brains, big dreams, Bob Bradley. We get to the start of the season and it was all right. They won their first 2 games. They played new expansion side Miami and then Tampa Bay. Both beat them by a score of 2-0. It was then followed by 5 straight defeats, leaving them joint bottom of the table at the time. Right now, you're thinking, okay, it's a classic expansion season. They're going to start off okay. They're going to fall to the bottom. It's going to take them some time to get going. Bobby B found a way to turn them around. They would go on to win their next 12 games in a row by a combined score of 31-8. They weren't just beating teams, they were murdering. At the end of this 12-game run, Podbronzy ended with 6 goals, Novak ended with 6 goals, Kasicki ended with 5 goals, and Razov ended with 5 goals. So that's 22 of the 31 goals that they scored from their 4 big players. They were clicking at a rate no one would have ever expected. At the end of this 12-game run became the start of a second, and that would be the U.S. Open Cup. Right at the end of their 12-game win streak, they were scheduled to play their first U.S. Open Cup game versus local rivals, the Chicago Stingers, a PDL side that had just upset USL A-League side, the Hershey Wildcats. If you remember correctly, we had a certain guest on our podcast who played on that team. I don't know if it was that specific team, but it's the timeline's right. That would be John Bush for anybody who didn't pick that up. I forgot Connor was muting himself through this whole thing, so I was waiting for a response, and it didn't happen, but that's okay. The Fire handled them easily, 3-1, wasn't really a test. And then 3 weeks later, they were matched up against fellow MLS team San Jose Clash. Lubos Kubik and Jeff Bacher traded goals that got them to extra time and eventually a penalty shootout, which in 1998 was way better than they are now. Big 35-yard run-ups. San Jose would end up missing. It would be Eric Winalda, scorer and focus of our first ever MLS history retold, and a man named Go, missing for San Jose, while Chicago took 4 of their 5 away to move on. They would get to the next round to take on the Dallas Burn. And this is one of the reasons why we're telling this story, because it's first off, the U.S. Open Cup, you will figure out, is very, very poorly archived. You can very rarely find highlights of these games. Secondly, it's 1998. Nothing is highlighted or archived or anything like that. So it's even tougher to find 1998 games. And I'm very upset about it because this game needs a 30 for 30. It's August 4th, 1998, in a game that would help go on to create the first ever fan-created rivalry in MLS, the Brimstone Cup, and we will cover that later in a future episode. Chicago Fire, Dallas Burn. This game was unbelievably chippy, and as I mentioned earlier, it had 45 total fouls, 18 for Chicago, 27 for Dallas. Ante Razov and Mickey Trotman would trade goals in the first 25 minutes of the game before getting to the halftime break even. Then, things get really fun. In the 52nd minute, our favorite US U20 manager, Jason Kreis, who has never failed our country ever, gets himself sent off for a challenge from behind. 4 minutes later, Roman Kasicki would give Chicago a 2-1 lead. Fast forward to the 66th minute, Diego Gutierrez would also be sent off for Chicago. There is nothing about what he got sent off for, but he was sent off with a straight red. This left the field to be 10v10. 5 minutes later, something happens, and again, I have no idea what it is, but Roman Kasicki gets a yellow card and then a straight red within the same minute. The 71st minute saw him get a yellow and then a direct red after that. Whether he pushed somebody, punched somebody, I don't know, but he got himself sent off, meaning it was now 9v10 in favor of Dallas. Chicago up 2-1, but down a man. 4 minutes later, Kubik gets put through on goal, and he scores a third goal. It is 3-1 now for Dallas. Dallas then earn a penalty kick in the 83rd minute, convert it, make it 3-2. They keep pushing, they keep pushing, they keep pushing, but Chicago holds on to get to the final of their first ever U.S. Open Cup in their first ever try. If they wanted to win it, all they would need to do would take down the Columbus Crew and they would have their first piece of silverware. However, because scheduling is so good in MLS, it wouldn't happen for another 2 months. They played 4 games in 1 month to get to this point and then had to wait 2 whole months to get to the next game. So we jump back. Let's go back to MLS days. After their 12-game win streak, you saw Chicago get very streaky. They went on a 5-game losing streak, then a 4-game win streak, then they won 3 of their last 5. They ended up making the MLS playoffs as the 2nd seed in the West, 3rd overall on the table, and earning an automatic qualification spot to the 1998 version of the CONCACAF Champions League. I believe it's called the CONCACAF Champions Cup or something like that. In their first season ever, not a bad return, I will say. But really, as people know, or people claim, I'm going to put air quotes around that, the regular season doesn't matter. It's all about your playoffs, right? So, after being 2nd in the West, their first game was drawn against Colorado. In 1998, MLS playoff system was a best-of-3 series, home, away, then home, win 2 and move on. Chicago gets Colorado, and in the first game, Kubik and Saenz would trade goals before getting to PKs, where the world's greatest American manager, Jesse Marsch, converted the winner to give them the first game in hand. In second game, Kubik also stepped up and put a penalty kick away in the 24th minute, and that would be enough to get them to the conference finals versus the LA Galaxy. These guys are going on runs that people against teams that you would think would just send them home. And this is one of those games against LA. In game 1, they got dominated. I mean, I'm pretty sure the shots were like 15-2 on goal. However, those 2 shots were very important. In the 86th minute, Kubik took a free kick right at the goal. That was their first shot on goal. That was parried right into the path of the greatest American manager of all time, Jesse Marsch, who would put the second shot on goal into the net. In the 86th minute, after being dominated, they would take game 1 miraculously. I mean, this was an LA team that was stacked all over the place. I mean, they blew the team out of the water. They won the Supporter Shield this year, and it wasn't even close. They move over to game 2. It's back at Soldier Field, and they just need 1 win to get to the very last game of the year. In the 31st minute, Peter Novak finishes off yet another rebound from Razov. Excuse me. To give Chicago the early lead. Minutes later, Danny Pena was wide open on the far side of the box for LA Galaxy to level the game from a Kobe Jones cross. This game, too, would head to PKs, where expansion draft pick Zach Thornton, who was the 2nd goalkeeper taken, by the way, behind Kevin Hartman, he was once again the man of the hour, making 3 straight saves to help the Fire get to the MLS Cup final. Want to win the first ever MLS Cup in your first ever try? What better way to do it than take on league giants DC United in the final? It's a one-legged game in front of 51,000 people at a neutral site called the Rose Bowl. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Oh, the Rose Bowl. That's right. Because we couldn't not put it where everything was happening, right? In the 29th minute, Polish Connection converts. Novak slides the ball across to Podbronzy, who taps it home for a 1-0. Then, seconds before halftime, Novak drives forward with the ball and rifles a shot that hits the chest of Diego Gutierrez and deflects into the net, giving Chicago a 2-0 lead. United would push, but Zach Thornton kept saying no, no, no. He made 6 saves in the last half of the game to keep a clean sheet and win Chicago their first ever MLS Cup. On a side note from the story, if you wanted to rewatch that game, there was a really cool sit down with Jesse Marsch, Peter Novak, and who was the announcer who was running it. It's on Facebook. It's on U.S. Soccer's Facebook page. I can't find it right now, but it was a very good watch along. I suggest you go watch it if you enjoy that type of stuff. It was one of those games that they played during COVID, where it was like, okay, there's nothing on. Let's put all the old highlights on. So super neat. But they make it to the MLS Cup final. This game was played on 10/25/98. That date is important. MLS Cup was played on 10/25/28 because if they wanted to do what nobody thought they would do and win the double, they need to turn around and do it 5 days later against the Columbus Crew in the U.S. Open Cup final. Because, again, instead of playing it in the middle of the season when you can move players around and not risk a playoff, they decided to take 2 months between the semifinal and the final of the U.S. Open Cup and stick the U.S. Open Cup final 10 days after or 5 days after the final, because why not? On October 30th, 1998, the Chicago Fire hosted the Columbus Crew, rolling out the same 11 that they did for MLS Cup 5 days earlier, ready for a challenge, and what a game it was. You can rewatch this whole game. Sorry, I lost my place there. You can rewatch this whole game with Jesse and Kloppus on US Soccer's YouTube page. That's what I was telling you before. Some of the key moments fall like this. In the 43rd minute, Josh Wolf was played in on goal. He takes a touch around a charging Jurgen Sommer, who takes him out completely, earns a yellow card, concedes a PK. Podbronzi steps up, tucks it home, and Chicago takes an early lead just before the break. Just 8 minutes after the restart, Crew legend Stern John stands over a free kick from 30 yards out. Thankful for football lines because I was able to measure it. It's tapped over to his direction, and he rifles this thing past Zach Thornton. An absolute firecracker from distance. Game is level. They would trade chances back and forth until we get to a sudden death extra time. That's right. Golden goal. One goal, winner take all. In the 99th minute, Podbronzi stands over a corner for Chicago. He sends in a cross that hits Razov in the head. It flicks his header towards goal, right to the feet of none other than Frank Klopas. He receives the ball from that header, finishes from close range, and completes the double in the first ever year of existence for the Chicago Fire. The story of the 98 Chicago Fire is one that most clubs can only dream of. Every new team is either being compared to Atlanta or LAFC, but the 1998 Chicago Fire set the standard for what an expansion team is meant to be. However, with the number of teams and the level of talent that we're bringing in each and every year, I don't think you'll ever see anything like this ever again. But when you want to talk about fairy tale starts, this is what they're made of.
So I got a question for you. After having done all that research, I know we're a little bit on track for it at the moment. Granted, it's very early, but do you think that my expansion teams can replicate that success? Not necessarily having to win the double. Do you think an expansion team in year one at this point in MLS could come in and win the cup in the first year?
I mean, if we keep passing it to their striker in front of our goal, then yeah, St. Louis can
Oh
win
boy,
whatever they
here we
want.
go.
But no,
That wasn't a segue for you to plug your agenda.
well, I mean, listen, you started it, I'm finishing it. No, I don't think so. I think not with the current restrictions in place. If you go ahead and set this up where you bring in an expansion team the same year, you say, okay, all strings are not attached. You go in, you get whoever you want, whenever you want. Let's do it. Then we can think about it. But the way that the league is set up and how they have to be smart about who they bring in and how they balance a roster, no, I don't believe that that's something they can do.
Okay. I would agree with you.
Naturally, because I'm always right.
Nothing else to add.
Had to throw it in there.
Should I?
No. I like that. I'm really interested to hear the other side of this, where the Columbus Crew were in the same playoff series.
Yes. On the other side of the conference, this was back when Chicago was in the Western Conference, even though nowadays Columbus and Chicago are obviously in the East. During this time, Columbus were also trying to do what Chicago was able to accomplish. As Andrew just mentioned, though, obviously we were not able to get to the point, but I will still tell you about their playoff run, which includes the final game at Ohio Stadium for the Columbus Crew. So, 1998 MLS Cup playoffs. The Columbus Crew are ready to make their third attempt at winning MLS Cup and are preparing for their final games at Ohio Stadium. But before we get into that, how did we get here? 1998 season for the Crew was honestly nothing special, except for one man. The team finished in fourth in the standings despite a losing record of 15 wins and 17 losses, giving them 45 points. The Galaxy were the Supporter Shield winners that season with 60 points, and they won it by a pretty wide mark. If you remember, I mentioned there was one man for Columbus that did have quite the special year this year, and that would be forward Stern John. His time in MLS was short, but very explosive. And this season, his first of two MLS, he finished with 26 goals, only one of which was a penalty. His top goal scorer by 7 goals in the league. So, some other notable mentions about some Crew players before diving into the playoffs. Brian McBride actually won goal of the year this year with a very nice scissor kick goal. And Thomas Dooley of the Columbus Crew won the Fair Play Award. And while this one isn't Columbus Crew specific, a certain someone was just bursting onto the scene this year, winning Rookie of the Year. And that someone is DP Pod legend Ben Olsen. All right, let's dive into playoff time now. Let's not go on a tangent. So the grid was set. Columbus had the 2 seed in the Eastern Conference, which matched them up against everyone's favorite Metro Stars. The playoff series at this point was still the 3 series until the MLS Cup final. So the Metro Stars were led a dangerous attacking duo of Gio Savarese, yes, that Gio Savarese, and Eric Hurtado, previously of the LA Galaxy. The first game would show that both of these teams were bolstering super dangerous attacks, as the game would finish 5-3 in favor of Columbus. Goals for Columbus came from Jason Farrell, Stern John, Rob Smith, and 2 from Brian McBride, with 3 assists coming from Ansel Elcock. While the Crew's defense did concede 3 goals, it did do a good job of keeping Savarese from getting involved, as he was subbed off with no goals or assists in this game. The Metro Stars goal scorers this game were Hurtado, Miles Joseph, and Mike Sorber. Game 2 was played at Giant Stadium, where the Metro Stars looked to send it to a decisive Game 3. The game would end in regular time 1-1, with Tab Ramos, the scorer for the Metro Stars, and Stern John, the scorer for the Crew. That meant penalties. And in that so Metro fashion, the Metro Stars would lose after they missed 3 of their 5 penalties. Columbus was on to the conference finals, but the opponent was not going to be easy. As we've discussed in the past, and as many MLS historians will know, the early days of MLS were marked by multiple DC United MLS Cup wins. They had a dynasty during this time. Well, the Crew were up against them with a shot at the MLS Cup final. This was a DC United team that won 24 games this season, 7 of which were in shootouts, and was not going to make it easy for the Crew. And game 1 was evidence of this. DC would win this game 2-0 after goals from Tony Sane and Marco Echeverri. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that there would be a final game at Ohio Stadium for the Crew. This next game was it. One way or another, this was the final game at Ohio Stadium. What better way to keep your playoff hopes alive while simultaneously giving a fairy tale ending to Ohio Stadium than by getting a win? And a win they got. They defeated DC 4-2 with goals coming from Thomas Dooley, Stern John, and 2 more from Brian McBride. while DC scorers were Tony Sane and Roy Lassiter. This meant that everything came down to the decisive game 3. It was not going to be easy for the Crew to take this, especially considering they would have to do it in RFK Stadium. Unfortunately, it was not meant to be. DC were simply the better team on the day and went to the final with a 3-0 win over the Crew. Goals in this game came from Jeff Agus and 2 from Roy Lassiter. And as Andrew covered, DC faced Chicago in the final and would ultimately lose 2-0 to crown Chicago MLS Cup champions for 1998. So while the Crew did not get the fairy tale ending Ohio Stadium that they probably would have liked, winning MLS Cup in 1998, they were at least able to end it on a victory.
Had to throw the Metro in there, didn't you?
Of course, I had to. Any chance I get to throw that some moment in there, I'm throwing it in.
Pretty dirty, not gonna lie.
What I didn't realize though, so when I was originally looking at it, I saw 3 missed penalties from Metro Stars, and I was like, wow, that's terrible. Like, how did they miss 3 of their 5 penalties? I forgot that it's MLS style penalties, which from what I gathered, looking at other penalty shootouts in the playoff, were much harder to score because teams were missing them like crazy.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So missing 3 out of 5 wasn't too out of place, honestly.
Nope, I get that. Like I said, that's far for the course if you look all the way back through it, right?
Yep.
Unless you've got anything to add, I think that's where we end it.
Yeah, that's all I got.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of MLS History Retold, otherwise known as episode 148 of the Designated Players Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you leave us a like, comment, follow us on any place where you get your podcasts, really, and then also on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. We're all over the place. So we love sharing these. We love you guys interacting with them, and we really hope that you are enjoying them as well. And make sure you follow along for next episode, which is going to revolve around the Project 40 team that produced tons of U.S. men's national team caliber players, as well as the coffee pot game. Is that right? The Charleston coffee pot game is up next.
Yeah.
Yes. We love those types of games. So please go on and make sure you are following if you want to listen to stuff like that. And we will catch you next time on the next episode of the Designated Players Podcast. See ya.